the effects of the tsunami were so devastating and quick that that type of planning couldn't have helped. But I think the question is at the national level what this disaster will do to spur further planning for natural catastrophes like this. I think everyone thought to some degree or another, what if this had struck Tokyo? A magnitude 9 earthquake and a tsunami that could have swept into the bay, into the low-lying parts of Tokyo. What would the destruction have been? And we all saw the video of the buildings swaying back and forth in Tokyo, 175 miles from the epicenter. How will major municipalities now change their disaster planning, not only for potential mega tsunamis of this type, but for the reality that a magnitude 9 earthquake can strike? Most buildings, and certainly the nuclear plants at Fukushima, were built for, I think it was an 8.2 magnitude earthquake. And as you go up the scale, even tenths of a point, the destructive power is magnified by the thousands of times. How will the nuclear plants around Japan, the 50-odd nuclear plants, be strengthened against the potential of both earthquake or those that are coastally located tsunami? And there is currently a plan to immediately begin looking at emergency preparations. For a long time, people have talked about whether, given the fact that Tokyo itself has been rocked by very large earthquakes with a regularity of about 70 years, so on that geologic scale, we're overdue for one in Tokyo. And just one quick point, and I'm obviously not a geologist, but the quake that happened was not on the fault line that Tokyo is situated on. It was on a different one. So this was not in lieu of the big Tokyo quake. But there have been for a long time, people have discussed the idea, should everything be centered in Tokyo when we know that it is likely to be hit by a quake? Should we disperse government offices? Should they be moved to other places, Nagoya, for example, or Osaka, or other areas? And I think you would see some of that debate restart, and some of it's already happened. And then finally, let me just mention a few potential long-term changes that may come out of this quake that some of us, I think particularly in the United States and around the world, have seen as we have watched with great humility how the Japanese have responded to this quake, as each of our countries in different ways have faced natural catastrophes. The first is what I think is clear is a strengthening of the social fabric, and certainly a reaffirmation of the strength of the social fabric, but a strengthening of the social fabric. What I would expect that will be a permanent increase in volunteerism in Japan. After the 95 Kobe earthquake, you saw a lot of NGOs start up in response to perceived problems that were brought into focus by the quake. A lot of those NGOs have swung into action since March 11th, and I think you will see a spur to a new generation to get involved in that way. Just yesterday, Son Masayoshi, the head of SoftBank, announced a massive donation. I actually forget the amount, 10 billion yen? 10 billion yen, right, okay, 10 billion yen to disaster relief and recovery operations, but also stating, if I have this right, at least as it was reported, that until he retires, all profits that he makes personally will be donated to victims of the quake, and specifically to orphans. So that type of social leadership, not dependent on the government, but social leadership coming from those who are able, at whatever degree, to contribute, I think is something that we will see. And I think in the tragic way, but in the way that one always hopes, the social fabric of Japan will be strengthened. Two other quick points. Japan's regional relations. As Minister Ishikawa mentioned, Japan has received aid from dozens of nations. Tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars have poured in. Aid from India, from Korea, from China, from Indonesia, from all around the world. And the degree, and I think Andrew will probably talk about this a little bit more, but the degree to which Japanese, from a domestic perspective, understand their interconnectedness with the world, the sense of support that the global community showed them, and how then, as a nation, as well as individuals, they will reciprocate. I think that will be something to watch and something that is very hopeful. And then finally, domestically, the role of the self-defense forces, I think, will forever be changed by this disaster. 2/3, 40%, I think, of Japan's self-defense forces, 100,000 troops out of about 240,000 regular troops, were deployed within days. They've been working around the clock, helping people in need, being seen in the worst areas of disaster where it is hard for government officials to get to or anyone else to get to. The SDF as a pillar, if I can put it that way, of society is something that I think will change its perception in Japan and lead it to be reintegrated more into the social fabric in a way that I hope would reinforce all of the other trends that I mentioned. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michael. Then, Andrew, please.
Thank you. Can I just say at the outset, it's an honor to be a panelist on a panel following Professor Tanaka's speech, since I remain grateful for his supervision of my doctoral studies when I was based at the University of Tokyo under Japanese government support. So thank you very much for that. I also agree with Michael Oslin's comments that it's a somewhat difficult transition period that we're in to move from just focusing 100% on relief efforts and hopes to find, more additional survivors to talking in a more sort of Washington-centric way of politics and next steps. But I'm reminded of Prime Minister Khan's speech last Friday, marking the 3-week point after the tsunami and earthquake, where he sort of symbolically changed his clothes from the disaster relief, blue jumpsuit into a business suit, and said it's time to sort of move on to the next stages. And I think that this panel, organized by the Japan U.S. Research Institute, is leading the way to do that, and I think it's quite important. But we still, of course, have to keep in mind that there are hundreds of thousands of people living in high school gymnasiums and other makeshift shelters in northern Japan, and, of course, people grieving tremendous losses. I'd like to sort of add to the stories, the uplifting stories, with a contribution from what I see at Washington College, which is a small liberal arts college outside of Washington D.C., about 1,300 students. But our students have really rallied to relief efforts. What Minister Ishikawa said about bake sales. We have bake sales going on. Our musicians union is hosting a big concert tomorrow. The Asian Culture Club, which includes exchange students we have from schools in China and in South Korea and in Japan and the U.S., are folding paper cranes. They're trying to fold one crane for every victim, and they're having the cranes adopted with monetary contributions that they want to send. So I do think it's ironically a time of togetherness, and I'm really struck by that. At a time where I often hear about, Japan passing and focus on China and other regions, it's really striking to me how much of a personal connection so many Americans feel to Japan. With that said, let me add some of my thoughts to comments that I largely agree on. There's a little bit of distance on a few points here, but I think the spirit of the comments that Professor Tanaka and Dr. Oslin mention are generally in agreement. I'd like to say sort of more to an American audience that I think it's natural that we think in terms of analogies to crises that the U.S. has faced. And in recent years, of course, 9/11 comes to mind immediately, but also the Katrina hurricane and its aftermath, and the Gulf oil spill. And I think that all of these events in the U.S. Shaped future American politics to a degree, and we might think about, how they shaped American politics differently. In my view, I think that Katrina and the Gulf oil spill of last year were more or less immediately politicized in the U.S. We understood them in a political fashion right away in allocating blame, where with 9/11 it was more of an event that drew people together initially, at least. Later, of course, we saw the splintering. So I tend to agree with Michael Ostlund that we will eventually see splintering and politicization of this movement. And I guess I also tend to agree with Dr. Ostlund that we're already seeing this to a degree, and I think we'll see much more of it in the next few months. I do agree, though, with Professor Tanaka that at a practical level, given that local elections were already delayed in Tohoku region because of logistical reasons, that it seems sort of unthinkable that you could have a national election when a region of the country couldn't easily participate. Whether that means that will be delayed until 2013, I think is a different issue. But certainly, I think this year it seems very unlikely. Also, I think from a political standpoint, you might even think of this recent weeks in terms of 4 disasters, in addition to the earthquake and the tsunami and the nuclear issues, was this Supreme Court decision about redistricting at the lower house level, which will require substantial thought and effort. So I think that also would contribute to an election not taking place this year. So let me say a few words about crisis management before I do talk more about Japan's international relations. I tend to agree with Professor Tanaka that overall I think that we've seen the Japanese government reap the gains of real efforts at improving crisis management systems since the great Hanshin earthquake in the Kobe area in 1995. It was after that earthquake that the Prime Minister's office for the first time set up a 24-hour crisis management center that has actually been put into effect quite a few times since then, since 1995, and I think each time it's being used, the processes are improving. And as both of our previous speakers said, the greatly improved use of the self-defense forces. I mean, the huge contrast is, of course, to the great Hanshin earthquake, when the self-defense force deployment was quite delayed. But this time, even as a defense specialist, I'm struck by how quickly the self-defense forces were mobilized and the incredible scale. You know, roughly, as Dr. Ostlund said, roughly half of the self-defense forces have been deployed, and the quick embrace of U.S. forces in Japan to provide support. Right, over 20,000 U.S. Troops who are based in Japan are providing relief efforts, hundreds of ships and planes, and very dramatically, I think, in the nuclear containment efforts, U.S. forces and equipment. I think that this shows, though, some of the things that those of us in more of the security community have been trying to impress upon Japan, that in a crisis it's important to be able to react immediately and to have procedures set out. And I think that the U.S. and Japan have made real strides in this area. I think there's been some hiccups in this area in the last couple of years that we were just beginning to get beyond. And I think that this disaster can serve to remind us of how important it is to have plans in place for contingencies. And ideally, you want to plan for every contingency. But I think what the tsunami shows is that in fact, you can't plan for every contingency. You have to have, procedures of working together and a spirit of working together and forces and, equipment that are able to be used in lots of different ways, because you can't foresee every scenario. I mean, sure, there was a large tsunami in Japan 1,000 years ago that we can see records for, but it's hard to prepare for each contingency that way. So, one anecdote that I've heard recently that I think is worth repeating is about an issue that the United States stresses a lot in terms of our alliance, which is about interoperability